Chapter 216, I'll pick you up in my car? Which genetic base point should he choose to strengthen then? Firstly, he eliminated the 10 genetic base points that were related to the lesser heavenly cycle of the genetic chain. They could not satisfy the first essential point. Zhu Tui would not be able to form a direct and effective comparison even if his abilities improved after the strengthening. Secondly, he had also eliminated the 47 genetic base points that he had activated in the Mind Concentration Foundation forging technique. Even if he successfully strengthened one of the 47 genetic base points, there was a high chance that it would increase Zhu Tui's mind power. Strengthening one of them would not increase his mind power by much. Zhu Tui might be able to sense it, but he would not be able to form a direct and effective comparison. The flicking technique of both hands could be considered as two small genetic ability chains. Strengthening one of them barely met the requirements. It should be able to match the first essential point and form a direct and effective comparison. However, Zhu Tui ruled it out after some consideration. Why didn't he choose to increase his strength with the same effort? Zhu Tui's current strength mainly consisted of his mind power. His flicking technique had already retired. With that, there were only 3 choices left. One would be from the reaction-type genetic base points. Another would be from one of the 8 genetic base points that were activated after the Black Crown Queen Bee's genetic transcriptional fluid was injected. The third was the genetic base point related to mental perception that he had recklessly activated back then. In terms of increasing one's strength, the 8 genetic base points that were activated after the injection of the Black Crown Queen Bee's genetic transcriptional fluid were the most suitable. However, the 4 genetic base points related to the mental chain and mental whip were already silver-white. They were the level 2 genetic base points that Zhu Tui had deduced. There were too many unknowns when it came to strengthening them. Moreover, according to Zhu Tui's theory, above level 2 was level 3 genetic base points. Under normal circumstances, it would definitely take much more energy and time to strengthen a level 2 genetic base point to level 3. Than to strengthen a level 1 genetic base point to level 2. So these 4 silver-white genetic base points were eliminated. The other 4 genetic base points related to mind power did not quite fit the first essential point. After strengthening them, they could not form a direct and obvious contrast. Therefore, the 8 genetic base points activated after the injection of the Black Crown Queen Bee's genetic transcriptional fluid were eliminated. Zhu Tui only had 2 choices left, genetic base points related to reaction speed and mental perception. However, his reaction speed type genetic base points had yet to form a completed genetic ability chain. Zhu Tui suddenly had an idea. Under the introspection state, would he be able to know in advance if there were any related genetic ability chains if he strengthened the activated genetic base points? This was in line with the rule of strengthening the entire genetic ability chain when the genetic base points had been activated. In this case, the inference was, if Zhu Tui strengthened one of the reaction-type genetic base points that had already been activated, would he discover a genetic ability chain appear during the process of strengthening and development? In other words, as long as Zhu Tui tried to strengthen and develop the genetic base points related to his reaction speed, he would be able to know if there were any genetic ability chains related to reaction speed. He did as he thought. Zhu Tui immediately began to focus on strengthening his activated reaction-type genetic base points under the illusory introspective state. Unfortunately, even after he tried the 8 genetic base points that he had activated, not a single genetic chain curve appeared. In that case, it means that the current genetic base points of the reaction speed type have not formed a genetic ability chain. Of course, it might also be because the key genetic base points have yet to be activated. Reaction-type genetic base points were also eliminated. There was only one option left, the genetic base point related to mental perception that he had rationally activated back then. While he was strengthening and developing the genetic base point that was related to mental perception, Zhu Tui exited his meditative state. He first did an extreme test on his current mental perception distance. Fortunately, Murong, who was next door, was not around for the past few days. Otherwise, Zhu Tui would have to avoid Luo Murong during the test of mental perception. Otherwise, it would not feel good if his lion roar broke it. The radius of his precise mental perception was 7.5 meters. The radius of his blurry mental perception was 15 meters. This was the mental perception distance that Zutui could sense after activating the 11th genetic base point of the second level. Compared to before, the increase in the range of his mental perception was getting smaller and smaller. However, the range of his mental perception was crucial. For example, the 15-meter radius of Zutui's blurry mental perception was the maximum range of attack that his alloy silver pill could reach. This was without the use of his mental chain. If he could increase the range of his mental perception, the benefits would be huge. Zutui once again entered the meditation illusory introspective state. He began to strengthen the genetic base point that he had activated, which was related to his mental perception. He made an interesting discovery the moment he started strengthening his genetic base point. This genetic base point that was related to mental perception actually flashed with 2 genetic chain curves when it began to strengthen. The first genetic chain curve was very coherent and bright. It only involved 6 genetic base points. Of the other 5 genetic base points, one of them was one of the 7 unknown genetic base points that had an unknown function in the direction of his previous abilities. The other 4 were all genetic base points from the first level of the Mind Concentration Foundation forging technique. The second genetic chain curve was also very coherent, but its brilliance was a little obscure. It formed a strong contrast with the brilliance of the first genetic chain. The second genetic chain curve included all the genetic base points of the 47 genetic base points that had been activated in the Mind Concentration Foundation forging technique, excluding those that were involved in the first genetic chain curve. This discovery made Zutui ponder. This genetic base point related to mental perception actually involved 2 genetic ability chains, one light and one dark. Could it be that the genetic base points related to mental perception involved 2 abilities? He came to a realization a few minutes later. In fact, Zutui had read about this knowledge in the theoretical books that he had learned about the genetic ability chain. Many genetic base points were diverse. Similarly, there might be several chains of abilities that affected an ability. Specifically speaking, the first very bright genetic chain curve should be the main genetic ability chain of mental perception. Only by activating this genetic ability chain could one obtain the ability of mental perception. The second dim genetic chain curve should be a genetic chain that affects the strength of one's mental perception. For example, the genetic base points involved in the second dim genetic chain curve were all genetic base points from the first and second levels of the Mind Concentration Foundation forging technique that Zutui was cultivating. The activation of these genetic base points could continuously increase Zutui's mind power. However, he had discovered a long time ago that as his mind power increased, the distance his mental perception could sense would also increase to a certain extent. He instantly mastered it. Zutui suddenly recalled in Zhao Xu's words, "The most common way of a genetic miracle was through self-experience. Only by experiencing it personally could one obtain the most convincing conclusion." He could also transform the theories he learned into his own foundation in the shortest time possible. After that, Zutui decided that he would completely give up on other aspects of cultivation for the next 1 or 2 days. He would focus on strengthening the genetic base points that were related to mental perception to verify the theory behind the development of color levels of his genetic base points. During the strengthening process, Zutui discovered something else. When he strengthened the genetic base point that was related to mental perception, he could still use 50% of the energy gathered by the mind concentration technique. However, the remaining 50% of the energy was shared by the 2 relevant genetic chain curves. The bright main genetic chain curve took away more energy, while the dimmer secondary genetic chain curve took away less energy. But that didn't matter. In any case, it was used on the genetic base points in Zutui's body. If he were to strengthen it over a long period of time in the future, his abilities might accumulate over time. With his current full mind power, he could consume 7 bottles of level E energy restoration elixirs in a row. Zutui was mentally prepared for the strengthening this time. The consumption would definitely be huge. It just so happened that tomorrow was a Sunday. He was also very curious about it, so he decided to train continuously. Zutui set his target at 8 p.m. on Saturday to begin his cultivation. After consuming 7 bottles of level E energy restoration elixirs at 10:30 p.m., his mind power was almost depleted. He immediately fell asleep. 6 hours later, he woke up. The high-quality sleep allowed his depleted mind power to recover to its peak state. Zhu Tui did not waste any time and continued cultivating. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Zhu Tui, who had consumed another 7 bottles of level E energy restoration elixir, and had almost exhausted his mind power, fell asleep again. He woke up at 1 in the afternoon. However, Zhu Tui did not start cultivating immediately. He was too hungry. He had to take care of his stomach first. He also needed to replace the waste from the Research Institute number 14 and the cultivation fluid from the incubator. He was busy until almost 4 in the afternoon. When Zhu Tui left Research Institute number 14 and Zhao Soxui suddenly said, "Zhong Ziking is treating us to a meal tonight. The place we booked is a little far. Do you want me to pick you up?" Old Zhong was treating them to a meal. Zhu Tui thought for a moment and knew what was going on. "Then he'll have to trouble you, Miss Anne. A flying car can save a lot of time." And Zhao Soxui glanced at Zhu Tun and said, "He'll be at the entrance of your dormitory at 6:30. On the way back, Zhu Tui received a call from Zhong Ziking. He could not miss this opportunity, so he immediately agreed. He quickly returned to the dormitory and gulped down a bottle of level E energy restoration elixir. Then, he began to attack the genetic base point related to mental perception. Zhu Tui wanted to know how much he had to invest in order for the strengthening to succeed.